Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm assuming some of you might have attended the sessions in the morning, and some of you might not have. So, if you have attended the sessions today morning, this might sound repetitive, but if you haven't attended, this will be new to you. So, I'm Satyam Vyas. I'm the founder and CEO of Arthan, a social enterprise that provides capacity building support to social organizations in India. We welcome you all for our second track called Future of Jobs as part of Arthan's new initiative called Building Civil Society Organizations of the Future. So, just a quick background on building civil society organizations of the future. So, in the past few months, we have seen the world reeling with the effects of COVID-19 pandemic. The civil society, like all other sectors, is dealing with the repercussions, and conversations about scripting a new normal are being heard across the board. We think it's imperative that we begin this process now and define it for the next decade if we want to achieve the sustainable development goals, progress towards which has been pushed back due to the pandemic by a decade or two. We still don't know exactly the numbers. Building civil society organizations of the future is a long-term, future-oriented, multi-stakeholder initiative by Arthan, where we would like to build a cohort of institutions that will collectively co-create solutions to co-evolve out of the pandemic and define the future of the civil society organizations in India. This initiative, which got launched last Monday on 22nd of June with a future of fundraising track, will run from June 2020 till December 2021 and will address ecosystem challenges by seeking to build a sustainable and resilient strategy for the not-for-profit organizations. As Arthan, we are committed to bring in diverse voices in the sector across regions, languages, and gender, and build accountability by converting these dialogues into action. The initiative will cover multiple themes, including but not limited to fundraising, jobs, education, women's leadership, gender, urban planning, impact investing, data and technology, and climate action. This constantly evolving universe will bring approximately 3,000 social sector leaders as speakers, and we aim to build capacity of at least 10,000 organizations through this, the knowledge we'll be creating over the period of next 2 years. The future of job track that went live yesterday and today covered multiple themes. All that information you can access on www.arthanevents.com. Just a quick note on the future of jobs track. So as we know that COVID-19 has affected employment across India and the world, the social sector, like the others, have naturally been affected. Recent estimates suggest that the social impact sector employs approximately 7 million people. There are 2 million people employed by the IT sector, so it's a significant number. And most of the people, most of the NGO leaders will understand that our employment numbers are not talked about it in the same manner as an IT employment would be talked about. So a reduction in funding, which we are expecting to be 30 to 50%, could mean 2 to 3 million or 2 to 4 million people left jobless, which is a very, very alarming and a challenging situation we have to deal with. Civil society organizations for decades have taken one on the most pressing problems in the country, in India and globally. But without people, without talent, which forms the backbone of the organizations, how can organizations create impact? So as we look into the future, we need to focus on building human capital in new ways as we script the new normal. There is an increasing need to think about how to keep the teams motivated, find alternates for job most impacted, rethink higher education opportunities. How do we restructure our organizations? I'll come to that in a more detailed note in a bit, and understand what the future looks like. So yeah, I mean, on that note, I would like to talk about this particular masterclass, which has been which is very timely and critical for the sector. So the masterclass on how do NGOs should go about restructuring. So as the social sector comes to terms with the pandemic and thereby the necessary pivots which all of us have been making in the last few months, and we expect those pivots to happen in the next couple of months or probably 6 months or longer, a lot of organizations, especially the NGOs, particularly are grappling with laws, regulations, and general functioning altogether. How do you go about restructuring? So this particular session, what you will learn, what we expect you to learn, is how do you go about restructuring an organization, and we will be taking up questions throughout to be able to answer based on your particular situation. I'm honored to have Samita Rao, a partner at Game Changer Law Advisors, as our speaker today. And Samita will be Samita will be conducting this masterclass. Just a quick background on Samita. Samita is a partner at Game Changer Law Advisors Bangalore office, and she has 14 years of experience. Prior to joining Game Changer Law Advisors, Samita co-headed the legal department at Goldman Sachs Bangalore office and was Goldman Sachs' sole employment counsel covering their India office throughout her stint there. Samita is well versed in enterprise risk assessment issues, handling sensitive investigations, and regulatory inquiries. Apart from spearheading Game Changer Law Advisors employment practice, Samita has spent the last year or so adding strength to Game Changer Law Advisors social enterprise practice. Since joining Game Changer Law Advisors, uh, Samita has worked with several leading Indian social enterprises and helped them navigate a complex legal and regulatory environment. Samita brings to the table strong transactional and advisory experience, having spent first 6 years of her career at the Bangalore office of Amarchand Mangal Das, Suresh A. Shroff and Company, where she advised clients on mergers and acquisitions, transactions, private equity, venture capital, investment transactions, spanning early stage funding rounds, all the way to pre-IPO round of funding. Samita graduated from the prestigious National Law University, Bangalore in 2006. So we are super excited and privileged to have Samita with us today. Thank you so much, Samita, for joining us today. And
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And I would just like to conduct a quick poll so that we know who's in the audience. Uh, so if everyone can take next 2 minutes to answer, please, that would be great. Last 20 seconds, if people who haven't voted can vote, please. Great. I will be closing the poll and sharing the results with everyone so that people can see who's in the audience. Samita, as you can see too, we have 35% representation of founders and senior leadership from NGOs looking to gain knowledge on restructuring the organizations.
Yeah.
We have 38% representation of individuals in the development sector want to learn about restructuring organizations. We have student and fellows, 15%, who want to enhance their knowledge base, and others, 12%. And for the question, what are some current challenges you're facing in the organization? Disruption in general operations due to the pandemic at 35%, unable to implement relevant information regarding to laws, regulation, 19%, having to make drastic changes to deal with the uncertainty, 42%. Hope you have seen all these numbers, Samita.
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. So I will stop the poll. Over to you, Samita.
All right. I will
just one announcement.
Sure.
Sorry. So we will be taking the questions as and when while Samita will be making the presentation. So please feel free to start asking the questions right from the beginning. We want to make this as interactive as possible. So we will not wait right till the end to take up the questions. So start asking the questions right from the beginning. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Satyam. Yeah, I was just going to start off saying, please do ask your questions as and when I'm making the presentation. So I believe all of you would have already received a copy of this presentation as well. So I'm happy to stop and take questions as I'm speaking through the slides. It's a short one, and hopefully it won't bore anyone. But I'll try to keep it as concise as possible. So the focus today, not today, of this session is on restructuring, and I see that from the poll there are a lot of you have answered that there is disruption and there's drastic changes that you need to make, and I'm guessing a lot of that will have to do with employees and restructuring your resources. So as you start to think about restructuring, your personnel and your human resources, I think the most important thing to remember is that transparency and honesty are of utmost importance. There is nothing really to hide here because the reasons for restructuring are probably apparent to everyone. Of course, there may be additional reasons that aggravate the current situation, but most of the restructuring is probably having its genesis or its roots in the COVID-19 pandemic and the consequential changes that are being required to be made in organizations. So firstly, build the business case for restructuring. So this should be based on hard-hitting objective facts like commercial reasons, operational impact, and other financial data that is available. The second is identify which teams. Once you have the business case, what are the teams impacted? It probably is going to be assignment or project based because funding is drying up or it's been diverted elsewhere. And then determine the kind of people housed in those teams that are impacted, and figure out your timeline. Again, here you have to be very practical and transparent about when you need to get this done by. Because there will always be things saying, okay, I need to be thoughtful about X, Y, Z because of personal reasons or other things. But you need to have a timeline in place and stick to that timeline. And then, of course, communication comes. You need to be clear about your communication strategy. Do you want to start with a address to all employees and then go talk to individual employees, or do you want to do it first individual employees and then talk to the rest of the remaining employees? So there are a lot of literature and a lot of thoughts around how best to communicate bad decisions. So that's something again that may be organization specific on how you want to implement it. So once you have this in place, then look at how you actually need to do the nitty-gritty, which is what is the documentation governing each kind of your staff. So broadly, you will have consultants who are not your full-time employees, and on the other hand, you will have full-time employees. So for the first bucket, those you just need to review the contracts, see what is the termination clause, see if any payments are due, if there are invoices that need to be cleared, and then proceed on that track. For the second category, it might be a bit more tricky because you need to be careful of notice periods. Make sure that you're either giving the notice period that is required under contract and under local laws, as well as you might want to consider offering some sort of severance or departure package, just in view of the unique situation that is facing everybody right now. Of course, this is subject to financial viability and other financial considerations for each organization. But it's important that you follow the rule book in terms of the notice period, in terms of ensuring timely settlement of all final dues after termination. that can be unused leave, salary up to the termination date, and any other benefits. So it's important to make sure that you've complied with all of this to avoid any legal challenges at a later stage. Coming to communication, I think it's obviously this is very difficult decision. It's not probably something that most people have seen in their lifetime, or even our parents' lifetime. So it's important to acknowledge upfront that this is a difficult decision, that it's a difficult environment, it's a difficult decision to actually let go of each individual person. You should be ready for difficult questions that come from employees. So I would typically advise people in this situations to have a ready-made FAQs with them when they go in for these discussions. And be thoughtful about who communicates this. So if you feel like the immediate manager or the team leader is not suited, you might want to have somebody a bit more senior and mature who can handle these kind of conversations, because often these might end up a bit more emotional and less about the business case and things like that. So be prepared and have a ready-made script as far as possible. Then you might want to think about reassuring the people who have not been laid off, who are continuing to remain in the organization on, this is that you have finished all the exercises of restructuring, and the rest of us who remain need to put our heads down, collectively continue as with the business. And that goes to the last bullet, which is again, have a strategy for the future. It's important. I think leadership becomes extremely important in these times because most people are going to be looking upwards at what the leaders are doing, and the sentiment and vision of leaders is what typically will distinguish good organizations from the ones which fail. I think the only parallel I can think of, and because of my past background, having worked in Goldman Sachs, which is obviously a very, very different sector from the social impact one, is the 2008 crisis that started, and in fact Goldman Sachs was extremely in the center of it and had a lot of negativity. So and there's a lot of written about it, is the banks which had great leaders are the ones which came out of the mess shining and stronger. So it's important to have a strategy and communicate that clearly as well. On the last one, and I'll be wrapping up with this slide, is have you given thought to anything else that you can do to retain people? Whether it can be job sharing arrangements, or having part-time workers, or salary restructuring, giving pay cuts and trying to retain more people. Second piece is, because of your restructuring, do you need to shut down a particular office, or do you need to wind up a particular legal entity? So these are all, again, organizational restructuring consequences, and they're probably something that are caught up in a lot of legalities, but it's important to consider all of this right up front when you start making out the business case. So it's because that can again be costly, and time-consuming affair to say shut down a society or a Section 8 or Section 25 company. So consider all of these things before making the final decision. And yeah, I think funding is just something that I mentioned here, but it's not the focus of this session. But basically, there are a lot of other options that come up for funding and fundraising for social impact organizations. And again, that may be other avenues that you may need to consider. Though, having said that, it may not be something that can come through in a short period, and may not be something that can help save employees that need to be laid off. So with that, I will stop here, and I think we can start the Q&A, Satyam. I have a question here, which is what is the second point after transparency and honesty? Apologies, I can just let you know. So the second point is identifying which teams are impacted. So,
So I guess maybe Satyam is facing some technical issues.
okay.
Sorry, yeah, sorry.
Back. Okay.
Even after these X100 webinars, unmuting yourself and switching on the video is a skill. So yes, I was just asking Muskan. Hope you got the answer. Second question from Nandita Jain: what would be the process to handle the emotions of employees being laid off?
Yeah, see, I mean, I can't give you a black and white answer on this. And like most things in the law, this is less about the law and more about interpersonal relationships. So this again will definitely be do not have one size fits all answer. So it really will be dependent on the person sitting in front of you and who's the one sitting on the other side of the table making the communication. So for some people who you are already aware that are emotional, you might want to start with a bit more of a longer explanation of the business case and then leave the absolute bad news to the end. And one thing I think which you should be very, very firm about is that the decision to lay off somebody is not something that is open to negotiation. Because the minute word gets out that somebody went into the room or went into a conversation where they were told that they are being laid off, and then they negotiated, no, I'm going to stay for a longer time. That's going to make the organization's job much more difficult to restructure. Because if you keep saying, okay, I'm going to give you the pink slip, no, I'm going to take it back, it leaves uncertainty up totally. It's worse off for everybody because somebody thinks they have a job and you think that you've already let that person go. So be careful about emotions, acknowledge them, handle them to the best extent, but make sure that you're not changing decisions on the spur of the moment and without any due authorization.
Follow-up question from Nandita only, Samita. After how long a company can restart hiring?
Yeah, so there are some regulations that apply to employees who are categorized as workmen, but that I would be very surprised if that would apply to companies, that entities here in the social impact sector. This is typically something that applies to factories and, even in information technology companies and those kind of manufacturing sectors. But there really isn't any ban on hiring just because you've laid off somebody. But keep in mind that what is the message you're sending out, right? If you're going to be firing, say, 5 people and you're a team of 20, and within 3 months, you're going to start rehiring. I think it would be a very, very just question that those 5 people who have been laid off are going to have saying, well, why did you let me go if you're just going to start hiring again in 3 months, right? So my recommendation would be conscious of the kind of hiring you're doing, especially within a short time after laying off people. Of course, you should be able to justify it. You might have a completely different skill set requirement, and of course, you should go higher. But I think there might be some expectation. It may not be a legal expectation, but there might be expectation if you're hiring that you want to bring back those people. But that's not a legal mandate that you have to do
that. I would like to add a question there, Samita, something that happened recently. So in a group of institutions, so if you work across different teams and portfolios, one of the entities is not doing well and people have been laid off, but the other entities are doing very well because of the pandemic, because the areas they focus on. So on one side you lay off people because they are not relevant, and the other side you actually start hiring immediately for things that are taking off. How does that work? I mean, again, I think you answered some bit of that from a branding perspective, but I'm just trying to also understand the justice organization gives to this 2 weeks of laying off people and hiring people?
Yeah, see, I mean, I think for the impact space, this is going to be project specific, right? So it comes down again to the business case. It needs to be very clear what is the business case, what is the reason you're hiring, and the same thing goes for hiring as well. That what is the business case for hiring there as well, right? So, like I said, it might be a different skill set. It might be that you've got a new grant, you've got a new project that you need to get started on, and that's the reason for hiring. And you might need people with different skills. You might, you take up a project relating to telemedicine, for instance, and you might be in dire need of coders. So
Right.
you need to hire them, right? There's no, your hands are not tied basically because you've laid off people. But be prepared that, if it's something will happen, you start hiring within, say, a couple of months after laying off, you might have to field phone calls from the people you just laid off. So be prepared for those kind of, awkward questions in a sense.
Right, right. Question from Sajdev Ramakrishna. In a cash crunch in these times, the expected trade-off between serving beneficiaries or projects committed to or keeping the organization going? Any idea on how to manage?
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? I think it might not always be a trade-off because if you have a particular project going where you have the funding coming in and you need to serve the beneficiaries, presumably that is the reason enough to keep people on. But like I think Satyam just mentioned, if you have projects which are drying up or they're just not doing well, I think they're not. You've met a couple of milestones and you've got the funding, but then there's nothing coming for the next 3 milestones, and you need to wind down that project. Then I think that's not really a trade-off. But you might be faced with a situation where a donor, say, for instance, says, I can only commit X amount, which is, 30% or 40% lesser than originally committed, and you still want to continue that project. Then I think, one way to think about it is to try and find another donor. If, that project is at a point where you don't want to drop it altogether. But you'll just have to figure out a way in which you can keep the project going, and if you want to keep everybody going, or you may want to let go of fewer people than you would have if the project shut down.
Thank you, Samita. Moving to the next question on, can you please explain the term social success note?
Yeah, so this is more a funding route that is, it's somewhat like the pay for success model kind of funding. So essentially here there is, say, a lender, which is, it can be a bank or an NBFC, which provides working capital to the social enterprise at a discounted rate. And the loan is basically underwritten by a philanthropic or a impact investor. And what this helps all the three stakeholders in this ecosystem is, one, it provides capital funding to the working capital funds to the social enterprise at a very discounted rate. Second, it provides an incentive to the NBFC or the bank giving it, because if the money is repaid, they get and the social impact is created, the philanthropic investor or the impact investor provides a reward or an incentive to the lending institution. And of course, it's a win-win for the funder or the social impact investor as well, because social impact is ultimately created. So these, I think, are a bit more relatively newer ones in terms of funding, but they are coming up slowly but surely in this space.
Thank you so much, Samita. Nandita, another question from Nandita. Are there any laws that NGOs should abide by in terms of exit packages?
No, there are no specific prescription in terms of how much you should provide as a severance or an exit package. But to just draw a parallel in terms of the the manufacturing or the other employees in the other sectors, the law there requires to provide 15 days pay for every year of service. So that is the typical market severance for other sector employees. So that's pretty much uniformly followed across most companies, even if it is an IT company or others. Of course, central government or government-related exit packages under voluntary retirement schemes and all are much higher because you need to provide a higher incentive for people to leave. But 15 days for every year of service is something that you could consider as a starting.
Thank you, Samita, for answering that. Question from Ashmeet Kaur. What would be your views on pay cuts? How to approach a conversation regarding pay cut? Is it advisable to share the financial situation of the organization with all the employees?
Yeah. I think this again is something you need to take a judgment call on, and it would depend on the organizational culture. I think a lot of social enterprises are pretty much close-knit and kind of, there's a lot of transparency in how the organization is working itself. So if you are generally a organizational, there is a culture of sharing information between management and employees, I don't see a reason why you would not share the financial situation. Because this is not something, that's arisen because of, you were not able to manage the situation well or mismanagement or fraud or anything like that. This is situation arisen because of macroeconomic reasons, and there are entities that have done a little better, but it's not like you're much worse off than most others. Everybody is impacted. My starting point always is to be transparent and honest, unless you have a very, very strong reason to withhold information. And the reason I also encourage that approach is people find it easier to trust the other person when you're more transparent and honest. And there will be a higher chance of them buying into your decision now when you place all the facts before.
Thank you, Samita. There's a question on NGOs and not-for-profit institutions have corpus for programs to sustain a rainy day. Can they also have corpus for staff salaries? Is there a legal sanction to it?
No, there's no legal requirement to set aside money, and keep a runway for staff salaries. Yeah, I mean, they can do this if, as a matter of, prudence and future rainy days, which may still come up, I think, in the next couple of years. But I think one other way of thinking about it, and just as I'm looking at this question, is when you get program funding itself, you might want to earmark a portion of that to say this is the cost that I will bear towards salaries. And understand from the donor if they are comfortable to set that aside and not spend it on the project itself, right? Because I think that's a more surer way of ensuring there's money in the bank versus trying to create a corpus out of other sources of income.
Thank you, Samita. Taking a question from Indu, as a follow-up to the exit package question. What in case of employees' performance issues and asking people to leave post performance improvement plan?
Sorry, where is, I didn't see this.
Sorry.
Oh, okay, following the question to exit package, what in case of employees' performance issues? Yeah, so yeah, I think I should have made this, mentioned this at the beginning of my presentation. So this reorganization is where we are talking about there is no fault, no misconduct. These are good employees who you want to let go. This does not impact what you would otherwise do as an organization with respect to your employees. So if you would have had a performance issue, or if you've had a case of misconduct, or you've had a case of, say, harassment, discrimination, fraud, you will proceed as you would normally in a pre-COVID era. So you will conduct your inquiry, you will, put the person on a performance improvement plan, and you will ask them to leave. If you don't offer packages when people leave because of poor performance, so be it. This follow what you would have otherwise done.
Thank you so much. I'm going back to Mr. Dave Ramakrishnan's question right at the top. Some companies abroad have done well outplacing these employees in other sectors to keep them economically alive. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think outplacement services for people, employees losing their jobs is a big lacuna as far as I've seen. Not just in the social impact, but any other sector as well, right? Like I think the only place where we've seen some sort of outplacement services is for technology companies, and just because of the ease of finding other jobs. But outplacement services, or they're otherwise known as relaunching or career consultants. These are entities that provide specialized recruitment for people who have been laid off. I'm not sure there are entities providing that service in India for social impact jobs. But probably, Satyam, that's another thing you should start thinking about.
I was going to add that, but then
yeah,
so, I
no.
mean, not that to start off. I think what has happened is a couple of organizations we worked with. I mean, they reached out to support their staff, and the challenge lies it's still the same problem of oversupply and less demand.
Yeah.
So when you're laying off people, even if they're quality people, the possibility of finding a new job in the present. So we have been telling people it can take anywhere between a 1 month to 3 months as a window. So we can't be, and I know you talked about that, 15 days salary when you're letting go of people and all of that. But, I mean, technically you will not, it's almost impossible in the present climate to find a job in 15 days. I mean, it was not actually possible even when the things were well. I mean, just from the process perspective. So outplacing, I mean, my opinion again is that it is very difficult to place people, even if you have the right intent, because ultimately it has to meet with the demand in the market, and demand has fallen drastically because of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think the only other way is to, I mean, for at least there could be a subset of employees who have transferable skills, right? Like coders or people in the operations portion of social enterprises, doing, data entry or those kind of, statistical analysis and those things. Those are things which we can transfer to other sectors. But yeah, I think it would, I mean, obviously I'm not the expert here, but like I would agree with what Satyam's saying, that outplacement is always been a challenge, and it's probably only going to get worse. And this is exacerbated by the lack of specialized entities providing that service.
Right. Question from Damini: What are the reasons that we got in trap of reconstruction of NGO? Which things we need to take care while reopening NGO? So I think the question is mostly that right now you have to go through restructuring. And if you, so probably like closing, Damini, we hope this is how I interpret the question. So you are stopping the organization's work and you want to start again in the future, and you want to understand what to keep in mind.
Okay, if that's the question, then see, if you're stopping the work, you must remember that the legal entity continues to remain. So you will have to maintain your minimum compliances under law. So for instance, if you need to file your returns under FCRA, you will have to do that. You have to file your, send your financials to your society's registrar. You will have to do that, even though you do not have any ongoing project. So some entities, maybe if you think it's easier, you can think of, winding it down. But again, for a trust, that's not possible in most cases, because it's an irrevocable trust. Again, winding down other entities is not something, again, that's very easy. So you might just have to keep the entity going until you get another set of assignments or projects to revive it. And to that extent, you might have a couple of employees on board whose salaries you will still have to continue paying through that dormant period.
Thank you, Samita. Next question is from Malathi. Restructuring or reformation is inevitable. Do you see at this juncture there will be a possibility of new and existing social enterprises engulfing a few grassroots NGOs? Of course, the purpose of intervention.
Yeah, so I think this is a sort of a suggestion at for a consolidation or merger of entities.
Right.
Probably that is something that will happen, but I think the challenge there is both legal as well as practical, right? One is that there is no formal regulation for merging uh, two trusts or two societies or two, between one trust and a society. So that itself is going to be a challenge. And the legalities may be something that, create a barrier to a merger. The second is a more practical thing of, even if you want to move the assets and the projects of one, say, society or trust into another one, which is a bigger one, because there is obviously the vision is the same. You're almost overlapping in terms of the beneficiaries and the work, or you want to build synergies between the two projects. The challenge again is going to be that are you able to do that seamlessly, right? Like, is the culture of both organizations fine? Is the way in which these projects have been run, are they similar? So you need to be very careful about mergers, I would think, even in the social impact space, and not just as with any other merger, that there is no, the magnetic pull should be from opposite direction. If it's in the same direction, then it comes back, right? So those are things that you will have to think about. But I would think there might be more project-based mergers happening, because you might want to pool your resources and say move into the education piece for rural migrant worker children, right? You might find more donors coming forth in a more focused manner, and then picking out 2 or 3 implementing agencies to do projects. Rather than in the past, it might have been distributed over a larger number of people. So I think consolidation at that level may happen in terms of trying to get more entities to come together to execute a common project. Because I still feel like the legalities involved in a technical merger, as you would understand it in a corporate sense, is going to be a challenge.
Thank you so much, Samita. Taking up a question from Sajdev, it says, Ms. Rao, you have a gamut of experience, Goldman Sachs at one, and now as an entrepreneur counsel to many successful startups. In these times, should one be surgical in the restructuring process or use a compassionate, broad brush, or more socialistic, everyone takes a pay cut approach? What is your opinion now? I like this question. Thank you so much for asking.
Okay, so I think you're putting me in the spot as well here. So 2 things here, right? One is that, like I said in my presentation also, it's very, very important to be humane and empathetic. I think that is the first thing that we should be. And I mean, I'm not entirely sure that you would qualify that as socialistic, but I would, be a bit more neutral and say, be humane and be empathetic. But you still got to be surgical. Like I said, start with the business case, and you have to remember that. You have to be methodical in why deciding what you need to do, and then stick to it once you're sure that you have made the right decision. So to that extent, I mean, socialism would mean that you try to bring on board the most people and keep most people on board. That might not be the wisest thing to do at this point. Right? If you have to let go of people, you need to be clear on why you're letting go, that it is the right thing for the organization and in the longer run, and be humane to the extent that you can. So, for instance, exit package is one, but another thing is then think of an alternate. If there's a part-time consultant approach you can take, then do that. I think this is a time when creative approaches are needed. So, which might be a bit more different from what you would have done in any other economic depression or a downturn scenario. So you got to be both. I don't think you can survive being either. So like being totally surgical on the one hand is going to be alienating to your workforce, and being socialistic is just going to make you, dig your own hole, grave, and go deeper in it, in my view.
I'm seeing, Samita, neither extreme right nor extreme left, somewhere in the center.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a client on this call, so I can afford to be in the center.
I would like to just you said if you cannot have people full time, you can have them as a consultant. So, what are the things people need to keep in mind when they're rolling out consulting contracts from an employment contract
See,
perspective?
consultant contract by its nature is meant to be, temporary. So, and it does not come with employee benefits, right? Like you
Right.
don't have to do your, I mean, you don't have to pay your provident fund. You don't have to provide of the any other benefits. So this can be pure time or material based work. So say you deliver me this X, you provide me with this deliverable, I'll pay you so much. So it's a very uh, completely independent relationship there, and there is no assurance of giving more work at the end of that assignment. I think that by itself gives a lot of flexibility, and what it helps organization is to get access to a skilled pool of resources, right? Depending on your requirement at that time, and that requirement may go away in a few months, or depending on the project it may be fulfilled in a shorter period of time. So where you do not have a continuous stream of work, or the nature of the work is or deliverable is such that you don't need it for a longer period of time, always do consider consultants. And I would think, and Satyam, you will also be able to see this, I'm sure, is that more people are willing to offer part-time work,
Right.
because I would think more people staying at home do have other responsibilities, whether it's childcare, elderly care, because of lack of access to other options. They will be able to say, I can spare say 10 hours a week, and I'm happy to work for that amount of time. So that's definitely something organizations should explore.
Right.
And I want to add also here that even if you've laid off someone as an employee, you can still get them back as a consultant at a later point if you feel that that particular skill of the employee was something you still want to leverage at a later point. Of course, you need consent on both sides, but it's not that you've laid off somebody and then you can never ever engage with them.
Right. And this is my also personal learning that, this is a time when it's very, very critical to look at the employment contracts from every perspective of foolproofing yourself, especially if you're an organizational, if you're running your own organization. So I think, we work with Game Changers for our own internal contracts too. And, also when we work with other institutions who will reach out to us on employment contracts, because employment contracts is quite complex. They vary from state to state. Delhi laws are very different from what is happening in Bangalore or Maharashtra, different establishments. And the larger the organization, the more complicated
Yes.
it gets, right, Samita?
Yes, absolutely. So, see, local laws will always be there in the background, right? That's something you just cannot avoid. What makes it complex is if you have multiple locations where you operate and you want to have a uniform policy. For instance, something as simple as leave. Karnataka says have 14 days. Delhi says have 20 days. So how do you have a uniform policy, right? So these are again adding to costs of having an employee. And larger organizations will offer medical insurance and things like that. So again, when for longer tenured employees, you are mandated to provide gratuity payments at the end of employment. So all of these costs are not there when you have a consultant. But my only word of caution is, do not hire consultants just because you want to avoid employment benefits. Because that is you're just violating the spirit of the law. You may or may not get caught, but I would say that's not the right thing to be done at this time.
Right, right, right. No, you are absolutely right. I remember one instance of a large organization. They were issuing employment contracts to foreign nationals as consultants, and they were not supposed to do that. I don't know the exact status, but I think at a certain point of time when a income tax raid happened,
Yeah.
mostly when they were filing GST, which was a lot of money, and when the income tax raid happened, they asked the organization for employment contracts of all employees in the last 7 years. and they found massive violation of people on tourist visa being given
Yes.
consulting contracts. So I mean, this is a social sector organization example I'm giving right now, and I think so it can be quite complicated. So as Samita said, we should never actually try to use these contracts to avoid legality.
Yeah.
You should hire a consultant when you need a consultant for a defined project, and once the project is over, the contract is over because they are not your full-time employee. Great, Samita. The question from Priyanka Thakur: what to do if employee is not performing as per his KRA, but when we have established task force, the employee performance is amazing. How can we judge based on KRA or task force for temporary basis?
So let me just see if I'll just reframe this and see if I've understood this right. I think basically there's a dichotomy in the employee's performance based on defined goals that were agreed with the employee and which he's not performing by. But when you put him on a particular project, there is an uptick in the performance. If this is the case, see, I think there could be a few. The employer or the organization might do well to inquire why this difference is happening. Most often, and I don't want to generalize, but most often, if employee is not performing well, he or she is not performing well throughout, right? Whether you try to change the project or you try to change the nature of the job or the role or reduce a particular piece or whatever. But if there is such a dichotomy that he's doing great on one thing but he's not failing by the other parameters, the reason could be just a simple mismatch in role and what his skill set is. So probably the task force or whatever the project that he's assigned to where he's done well, that plays up to his strengths. So that may be something you need to investigate a bit more and see if that person is actually not suited to the earlier role that was assigned, and project based or that particular kind of skill set is what he's actually excelling at. So that I would recommend doing some amount of questioning and investigation based on this line before taking a decision that he's a poor performer and needs to be let go.
Thank you, Samita. Now, from a job seeker perspective, question from Ruth: what are the rights employees have at this time during layoff? Is there any grievance redressal mechanism for the employees? Which is very, I think during this time, Samita, also the number of people getting laid off is obviously way higher than the number of organizations who are restructuring, right?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, see, I would love to tell you that, contact XYZ and to raise your grievances. But the short answer is that there is no specific grievance redressal mechanism just because you've been laid off, right? Looking at it from the employee's perspective, see, it's not like there's job security at all times, right? The employer still retains the right to restructure, and if that means laying off people, that is something that they can do. What you can do to raise a grievance is if there have been procedural irregularities. For instance, if you have not received your salary up to the last date of termination, you have not received your gratuity if that is due to you, you have not received your full and final settlement on time, or your contract says you should be given 3 months notice, but you were only given 1 month notice. So those are causes, grounds on which you can raise a grievance. And the only way in which you can raise that grievance is, one is, of course, go directly to the employer and threaten to sue, which is, often a very compelling way of getting some amount of settlement. But if the actual grievance redressal will have to happen in a court of law. So you will have to go to the jurisdictional civil court, file your claim, explain why you think you have been illegally terminated, and then the whole court case will start. Then the court will give notice to the employer. The organization will then file their own response. Then you have to show your evidence. Then you can examine any witnesses, and then you will come to a judgment. And let me tell you, I don't foresee this getting redressed at least for 4 to 5 years. So going to a court of law is extremely time consuming and will also be expensive, even if you get someone a lawyer who does not charge high fees. So it's very, very rare that layoffs are challenged. And I must also point out that courts typically do not interfere if the legalities of termination have been followed. So they will not say that the NGO should not have fired this person because of the business reason. So courts will very, very rarely go into the business reason why an employee was laid off. So the limit of their judgment will be limited to, were the procedural formalities followed? Did you receive your notice on time? Did you receive your settlement on time? And those kind of things. So there is a very limited scope for a court to look into these kind of grievances. Or of course, then the other whole bucket is, if you feel you've been discriminated or you were laid off as a, it ends up being a harassment tool that you were laid off. So those kind of challenges are of course different, and those may be a bit more successful than your business-related layoff.
Thank you so much. Taking a question from Anuradha Kamath, with the CSR kitty pretty much shrinking, massively reducing funds on non-COVID causes like education despite high engagement in pre-COVID era, how do we maneuver fundraising? Thoughts, ideas on unique value proposition?
Okay, I must confess that I'm not an expert on this, but look, I think a lot of NGOs are turning to, the likes of Millap and Crowdera and crowdsourcing platforms to raise funds, especially because it gives access to people who have otherwise never been tapped into. I think retail donations are something that have been largely untapped in India, and a lot of people do. I think a lot of NGOs have been successfully raising funds for their specific projects. So those are things that you could explore. See, the other piece is there are proposals in India to set up a social stock exchange and then have even not-for-profits list on them and have a greater access to pool of fundraising. But I don't see that coming up at least for the next 6 months or even longer. That's something that's but actively being thought about and by the government as well. But I think one thing here is that we are, let's face it, right? Like COVID related causes are the ones getting all the funds, and for a very good reason. So even on platforms like crowdsourcing platforms, if it is not something that really touches a chord with donors, you probably may not be very successful in raising funds. So I think the other avenue we see social enterprises driving towards is government partnerships, where there is some amount of government support or working with the government, and that gives you more access to funds, or at least in the short term gives you a cause for implementing projects. So I doubt there is like a unique value proposition, but Satyam, I think you might be better placed to answer this.
So I will just talk about some of the learnings from this week. So Anuradha, on Monday, we ran a track on future of fundraising. I don't know whether you attended that or not, but first thing we learned from a bunch of international foundations is that foundations are looking at grant making, but they will want to give collaborative grants. So they are collaborating in terms of their pool of resources, and they also want NGOs to collaborate. So here in this case, an example would be that if you're working in education, the possibility of 2 or 3 NGOs partnering together, bringing their unique strengths, going to a foundation that supports education is very high. And if that one of the NGOs in that partnership will have an FCRA license, your access to international foundations increases drastically. So that's for the international foundations. The second thing we heard from few CSR leaders saying that even after the money going to COVID-19 PM care, there's still some pool of money left, and the decision making has to happen in the next 3 months. So the possibility of accessing CSR capital remains very high in the next 3 to 6 months. It will go down drastically in 2020. So this is a time to go back to all the funders who you would have interacted with. So if you were dealing with 10 foundations, try to increase that number to 50. Your outreach has to increase drastically. Today, the session before this, Narayan from Azim Premji Philanthropic Initiative mentioned that Azim Premji Philanthropic Initiative have given 333 crores in the last 3 months to few hundred organizations, and they have gone beyond their beyond the 25 thematic areas they invest in. So if you are doing anything that they see value in, they will fund it. So you know there are some incredible positive stories too. It's just a question is how do you reach out to these guys and have a conversation with them. And plus, Samita mentioned retail giving. One of our partners called Rootbridge Academy. They specialize in retail giving, and they have been running master classes on how do you like go about retail giving and raise money. There are tremendous benefits of retail giving. It's cost effective. You can launch it immediately. You do need to go back to your supporters and have a database of everyone who you have interacted with. I'm not a fundraising expert. I'm just trying to summarize what I've learned in the last few days. So hope Anuradha that answers some of your your question or concern around the fundraising piece. Moving on to Indu, legal applicability for employee insurance benefit has changed during this time. How can we handle or make change? So what happens if you what happens, Samita, if the contract gets terminated? What happens to all the benefits, provident fund,
Nothing.
medical, insurance?
Everything goes away once you stop being an employee. So, so just on the question itself, there's no mandatory employee insurance that an employer needs to take, except that covered employees, you need to provide for employee state insurance, which is the ESIC. That is, for employees who earn less than 21,000 a month, you have to be contributing towards their ESIC, and that gives employees an access to the ESI hospitals and their whole, health insurance, hospitalization benefits. The biggest change that has come about is way back in March, or maybe I think early April itself, the Insurance Regulatory Development Authority, which regulates the insurance sector, has clearly said that COVID-19 is something that all insurers should cover. So, while there used to be, the whole discussion on, okay, so, chemotherapy or dental treatment, is that covered in insurance? That whole discussion cannot happen if there is a COVID-19 treatment. So that, in fact, has led to a large benefit being granted to, sickness in terms of sickness coverage during this time. Because I think the biggest worry is, how am I going to cover the costs of a COVID-19 treatment? God forbid it comes to that. So insurers have to mandatorily cover that in their insurance to the extent that somebody is covered under insurance. But having said that, I think a lot of companies, including smaller ones, are now exploring taking a corporate or a group insurance cover for their employees, even if it is just 20 or 25 employees that they have. And that, in fact, I think is something people might want to prioritize at this time, because that is something that will go a great way in creating goodwill amongst your workforce and building loyalty. Because obviously, I think it's human that if somebody helps us out during our difficult time, we're always going to be grateful, and building gratitude amongst your workforce is something that is never something that you will miss. So it's important that you think about sparing the money to purchase an insurance. And there are a lot of products available right now, especially tailored towards the current pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you. Samita. Question talking about, given that I've lost the job currently due to unexpected non-renewal of contract, and I may not get hired for some time in the current situation, is this a good time to work on your own idea and be self-employed? meaning structure my own organization, asking if the registration and other legal and regulatory processes involved are moving with adequate speed and functionality right now for anyone to start a new venture. Would you advise working to create your own venture in the current situation?
So I can answer the first question, which is, the registration and legal regulatory processes.
Right.
That frankly depends on what kind of entity you're planning to register, right? I can tell you a trust and a society will take forever. But a Section 8 company probably is something that might happen a bit faster. A regular private limited company can be set up with ease. There's no issue in that. So for a for-profit entity, you don't need to be one of these. You don't have to be a trust or a society or a Section 8 company. So setting up a private limited company is very easy right now, and that's not changed because it was always online, and that continues to be online. What you should remember is though that there will always be a host of compliances attached to setting up an entity. It's always easier if you want to start off with, say, a proprietorship or a partnership, and keep compliances from a legal and regulatory perspective at a minimum, because you don't want to be spending money on making your filings or going and applying for licenses and things like that. I mean, I honestly, I think if you want to start your own venture and you think this is the right time, this is, and there is no job on the thing, this is probably a good idea to do it. But you will have to consider the nature of the entity that you want to set up.
So there is a follow-up question which I'm picking up right at the bottom. It says, what is the best way to structure NGOs, trust or Section 8? Is there any benefit for one over the other?
Okay, trust or Section 8. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think just on that, so if you are an entity that relies on CSR funds, I think I must point out here that the latest CSR amendments the proposed CSR amendments issued by the government, they are focusing on a Section 8 company. They want to do away with a trust in a society as CSR implementing it. Because I think the thinking from the government side is that trust and societies are not as governance strong as compared to a Section 8 company, and the mechanism for governing trusts and societies are all over the place. It's not a centralized one entity that governs all trusts and all societies. Whereas for a Section 8 company, it is the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, and if you want to take action, you can just go through the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. So their proposal is to do away with trust and societies and only have Section 8 companies as CSR implementing agencies. So if you want to keep your eye on the CSR funds in the future, just be mindful that the government seems to be appearing to prefer a Section 8 company. But otherwise, I think a trust and society have limited uses in terms of the nature of charitable purpose, right? Because some things might be, where you have where you have donors willing to settle a trust. You can't do that with a Section 8 company. So you would have to not necessarily do it as a trust. Or, you want to have society with members, buy to membership, that you can't do again with Section 8 companies. So it will really depend on what is the nature of the NGO, what sector they're working in, and what kind of funds they're planning to obtain. And of course, I think the whole FCRA piece is there. Again, maybe a Section 8 company might be something that might get prioritized over other entities in FCRA license process.
Last question in the window is where could we find more information on laws and other resources, especially for charitable trusts?
So these are state-specific legislation. So you'll have to see which state and then look at there's something called a charity commissioner or where you can have these things, but states regulate charitable trusts. So you will have to look at state-specific, like there'll be a Delhi Trust Act or a Delhi Charitable Trust Act or a Karnataka equivalent. So they will have, most of them have websites, but otherwise, yeah, I think there are some other legal websites which have some legislations published, but they may not be complete.
Samantha, question, can a trust be converted into a Section 8 company?
No, so a trust cannot be wound down. A trust cannot be converted to anything else. You can transfer its assets into another entity, but there's no concept of conversion. Even a society cannot be converted to another form. So what you'd have to do is, wind down the society and then set up something. So what you can only do is you can convert a Section 8 company into a regular private limited company, which is basically you surrender your charitable registration under Section
8. And what, Samantha, what does one has to do if you have to wind up a trust? How do you go about dissolving a trust?
Trust typically cannot be wound down because it's issued as an irrevocable trust. So the amounts are settled there. What you can do is, distribute whatever revenues are there towards the beneficiaries, and then there is no corpus left. That's all you can do. But a society and a Section 8 company can technically be, dissolved or wound up.
Got it. Thank you. A question, I haven't got my salary for the last 2 months while other employees got it. Can I leave the organization without giving 1 month's notice?
And I'll agree to it for the last month as I've done. Yeah, I mean, I think you can view this as a breach of contract, and you should be able to leave without giving 1 month's notice. Or you should say that, your notice, you should consider it for the last month when you were not paid. That is your notice, and you've served your notice, and you can.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not being paid by the employer, you don't have to.
Together the relevant people for something as simple as fundraising. Because if you have a network of networks, you will be able to even more have access to more fundraising opportunities for something using that kind of network. Again, another great opportunity that can come out of a network of networks is outplacement. When you have employees looking for jobs, and that's another avenue where people will be able to leverage a network of networks. And again here, right, if you need to pool resources and come together and make a joint proposal for international funds, that's another avenue to leverage the network of networks. Yeah, who knows? I mean, it's during difficult times, certain people start growing and things come up, business models come up. So we might see the network or alliance coming up pretty soon.
Thank you, Samantha, for answering that. Question from Sajdev. This is Ms. Rao, you have been an M&A deal-making legal expert. Do you think the environment is ripe for consolidation triggered by the pandemic? Too little money chasing similar to many causes. You did mention that consolidation among not-for-profits may be difficult. Why?
Yeah, so I think the consolidation in terms of what is commonly understood as a merger where, two entities become one, that may not happen because of just the legal entities being, structures being different. So while, two private limited companies or public companies can merge and one can be wound down, that's not as easy to do between a trust and a society, for instance. You can't merge a trust and a society. What you can definitely do is pool resources or create another entity which is kind of like a joint venture, right, where you have consolidation and have a common vision and you want to leverage synergies because say, you have one entity working in Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, you have another one working in Karnataka. So you want to have a joint strategy for South India or, something, some other kind of reason which prompts the consolidation. So there's definitely something of that kind going to happen. And like you mentioned, even from learnings from your fundraising day, there is a dire need for pooling of proposals, funding, and have one voice talking to donors, right? I think that would make a huge difference.
Thank you, Samita. Priyanka, I think we have I think there were follow-up questions from you, which is now when it's in different steps, we are not getting it. But I think it seems like that the task force.
Okay, I think that was an explanation for that.
Yeah. Task force basically created for the campaign group. So versus the regular staff.
Yeah.
Got it. Thank you. How to initiate social enterprise in case organization is facing funding problem, do's and don'ts. Manohar.
I'm not sure I understood the question, but
how do you basically basically do's and don'ts of a Section 8? Like, so if you're facing issue as an NGO and you want to register the Section 8, I am not sure, Manohar, even that solves the funding issue, because even a Section 8 company needs money. From a service delivery perspective, you can be delivering services even as an NGO if you get the work. So no immediate funding problems can be resolved because of Section 8 registration. I think Samita mentioned that long-term government prefers Section 8. So when CSR capital will come back in 2022 or 2023, 2022, let's be optimistic. There is a possibility that the preference will be given to Section 8 over a trust and a society. But that is only true if you are healthy and you have, you have funds to sustain yourself for the next foreseeable future.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Frida, we haven't got your entire question, so we won't be able to answer how do we approach this situation. I'm not sure whether there was an earlier question to this. If you have, you can rewrite the question, please, Frida, and then we'll try to answer that. Newer NGOs are facing issues to get ATG, but companies require that for CSR funding, even if the NGO is clean.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's difficult on CSR donors, because if there's no ATG, they can't even claim it as a deduction. Because CSR funds cannot be, categorized as a business expense. That's been very, very clearly reiterated. So the least they want, at least, to claim it as a deduction under ATG. Yeah, I think, income tax getting this ATG or even the 12A certificates have traditionally been a challenge, and I don't have an answer to that, but I can tell you that we are hearing similar stories in other places as well.
So one more thing, Frida, I think has the same question. So Frida, Samita has already answered, but we are also seeing that everyone who has a 12A in ATG has to go for re-registration starting 1st of October for a few months. I think the re-registration will be for 3 months, October, November, December. That's a big move by the government, and actually I'm not sure, I've not been recently, in the last 2-3 weeks I haven't followed up the updates, but even if you have received a certificate in the past, you have to still go and apply it. So we are definitely looking at some massive regulatory challenges coming up in the next foreseeable 6 months. And I'm not an expert, I'm just sharing what I know. And probably, like, Samita, at a certain point of time, we should think about, like, what an NGO should keep in mind while they go for the re-registration process, because this will be happening for millions of organizations in the country.
And I mean, I think income tax and FCRA are the, like the plagues for the social impact sector, because, unfortunately, the social impact sector have also, the brand itself of the entire sector has been tarnished because of a few bad apples, starting with, all these FCRA registered list of NGOs and all of that. So there is an unfortunate stigma attached of, fraud and diversion of funds and all of that. And it's no surprise that at this time, when there's so much of funds flowing into COVID-related relief efforts and other projects related to COVID, that the government, really wants to keep a closer eye on, how exactly those funds are being used. Because, like it or not, this is the right time for embezzlement, fraud, and cheating, and all of those kind of things. And all it takes is just one bad entity, and the whole sector is under scrutiny all over again. Because, like I said, there is an belief or appearance that it's not governed well. It's like, it's a simple thing, right? Like, you always think that a company that's listed on the stock exchange is actually very well governed, because they make disclosures every day to the stock exchange regulator, and they publish these big reports giving all information. But there are stock exchange scams, there are stock market scams. So, but that does not tarnish the entire listed companies, right? I think that's the probably another reason why a social stock exchange might be really something helpful to the entire industry. And it's very promising what has been proposed by the SEBI in the last month. And let's hope that sees the light of the day sooner than later, because it will open up a huge amount of fundraising opportunities for well-governed even NGOs. It includes fundraising opportunities for both for-profit as well as not-for-profit entities. So let's see. I'm sure this is going to be something that's changing drastically, pretty much on a daily or a weekly basis, and creative opportunities do come up for everybody, and we'll stay tuned in.
Thank you so much, Samita. I think with that, we are done with all the questions. I hope if anyone has one last pressing question, we can take. But in the meanwhile, I would like to launch the poll. If you have attended this session, please give feedback, and this will help us improve the design of our future sessions, and we'll understand that we managed to answer your questions and concerns. You have 2 minutes, actually 1 minute to answer the poll. If you can very quickly just answer the questions in the poll, that would be great. I would just wanted to add, Samita, around the people who question civil society about how the money is going to get utilized, especially the government, has not disclosed how PM CARE is going to get like.
I agree.
So I guess it's a very.
There is actually right to information or a PIL or something pending in the court.
They have killed the PIL. The PIL doesn't stand anymore. I think it was done like almost a month back.
Yeah.
They said it's not. Basically, PM CARE doesn't come under the ambit of RTI. And someone actually revisited and said if it's a public announcement, it does. Some lawyer is going after it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it's a quite complex case to navigate. And we actually don't know, because technically speaking, all the CSR funds have moved towards PM CARE.
Yeah.
And PM CARE can actually give money to not-for-profits to implement, because they have let's say the foot soldiers it's across the country. So how do we, I don't have an answer. I'm just generally thinking while waiting for people. We have 43% of the people who have voted. Can we please get everyone else who has not voted to vote? It would give us a sense of where we stand. But yeah, so I guess I think it's also important for us to question this. And I'm not talking from a legal perspective. I think the voice of the collective people coming in together should lead to answers.
But I think this challenge of the PM CARES is there in most funds set up for national relief works. I think even the PM Relief Fund or those disaster management funds have traditionally been opaque and have not disclosed a lot unless it's been pushed through by legislation much later. And I can tell you, from my experience during Goldman times, contributing to a fund was the absolute worst case. If there were unspent CSR funds, people prefer to just disclose it as such rather than give it to thing. But I think it's an extraordinary situation now. People don't want to be stuck with unspent CSR amounts, so they'd rather spend it on the PM CARES and get done with it.
Samita, Janta Ka Darbar or Aapki Adalat says that your session has helped in understanding the challenges that are required the changes that are required, have a better understanding of the changes that are required to restructure my organization. So we have more than 90% of the people who agree and strongly agree. Then this session has enabled me with information that will help my organization in making pivotal changes to deal with the current pandemic. we again have almost 90%. I think Samita going to analyst help. It seems like all the 90% score is coming back in again in fourth. The session helped me understand the legalities of NGOs, restructuring NGOs better. We again have like almost 80% of the people agree and strongly agree. You have 0% of the people disagreeing or strongly disagreeing, Samita.
People are being
In the
kind.
previous session, we had 1% who was strongly. So I think, thank you so much, Samita. This has been very, very helpful. Thank you once again for coming to the Arthan platform and helping out the people with their key concerns. We have already shared the deck with everyone, and I'm sure Samita's details are mentioned in the deck. If you haven't received, Samita, do you have a email ID we can give to everyone?
Sure.
For people who want to get in touch with you?
Yeah, it's there on the deck. Otherwise, it's just my name at gamechangerlaw.com.
Sure. So if you have, if you have more questions related to your specific organization, I would recommend reaching out to Samita directly. This is it's a critical thing. No matter how much we talk about it in a platform like this, it's a very different case for every organization. So try to if you have questions, you can directly reach out to Samita. You can give a reference of this webinar, and then Samita will help you. Or Samita is already. Mridula, thank you so much for giving Samita's email ID to everyone. So with this, we will come to an end of this session. For people who want to attend our next session, we have a roundtable with women leaders in impact, managing team talents and productivity starting at 4:30. So if you want to log in for that, that's a separate session. So you can attend it if you want to. For everyone else, thank you so much, Samita. Pleasure having you once again.
And good luck.
Yes, thank you so much. Take care of yourself. Bye.
Bye-bye.